Hello, my fellow weirdlings. It's Margot, and today I'm talking about the bizarre phenomenon known as the New England Vampire Panic, and in particular, the last New England vampire, Mercy Brown. So if you're ready for some really weird history, keep watching. 200 years after the Salem witch trials, superstition-riddled New Englanders were at it again with their supernatural shenanigans. This time they had the added misery of tuberculosis, which was known in the 1800s as consumption. The tuberculosis epidemic in New England began in the 1730s, a few decades before the first known vampire scares. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, entire families in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, and other parts of New England were falling victim to the spread of tuberculosis, or TB. By the 1800s, when the vampire scares were at their height, the disease was the leading cause of death throughout the northeastern United States, responsible for almost a quarter of all deaths. In 1892, the year Mercy Brown died, TB was still the leading cause of death in the U.S. Its symptoms included a blistering fever, extreme fatigue, night sweats, violently coughing up white phlegm or foamy blood, and a visible wasting away of the body. The progression of symptoms made it seem like something unseen was draining the life and blood out of the afflicted. It was absolute torture, often drawn out for years. There was no cure or reliable treatment at that time. Doctors often recommended that TB patients simply rest, eat well, and exercise outdoors. Common treatment suggestions included drinking brown sugar dissolved in water, frequent horseback riding, or bloodlettings, which explains why there was only about a 20% survival rate. Those who survived often suffered recurrences of the disease and later died of either TB or other residual breathing problems. At the time, doctors were unaware that the infection was airborne and spread mostly through coughing. It passed easily between people in close quarters and tended to sweep through entire families. This especially affected the poor because they tended to have more people living under one roof and in tighter spaces. Though German scientist Robert Koch discovered the bacterium that caused tuberculosis in 1882, germ theory wasn't widely acknowledged, accepted, or understood for another decade. It took the longest for this information to reach rural areas, and even if the information was readily available, drug treatments wouldn't become available until the 1940s. Infection rates finally began to go down as general public hygiene and nutrition improved. In the time before germ theory and the cause of TB were understood, people dreaded the disease but didn't understand it. This bred fear and paranoia, especially in rural areas, as uneducated and superstitious people tried to make sense of the immeasurable loss and suffering within their communities. For many, protecting against this perceived evil became an obsession. Not surprisingly, people began pointing fingers at the victims. In fact, the year Mercy Brown died, one physician even blamed TB on drunkenness and want among the poor. Because TB often spread throughout entire families, surely the first to be afflicted must be somehow purposely or subconsciously affecting the others. Legends of vampires have actually existed for millennia. Though modern vampire lore is often associated with Eastern Europe, vampires and witches were also a real threat in the minds of colonial Americans. There was specifically a lot of perceived vampire activity in South County, Rhode Island, from 1870 to 1900. During this time, a popular superstition arose that stated, quote, "By some unexplained and unreasonable way, in some part of the deceased relative's body, live flesh and blood might be found, which is supposed to feed on the living, who are in feeble health." End quote. Basically, the myth claimed that when members of the same family wasted away from consumption, it could be because one of the previously deceased family members was draining the life force from their living relatives from beyond the grave. After Mercy Brown's story made headlines, noted anthropologist George Stetson traveled to Rhode Island to investigate. He later wrote to a colleague, "I found in Rhode Island the last summer a dozen or more well-authenticated cases of families that followed the demands of the superstition and showed their faith in it by exhuming the dead." While this probably sounds completely unreasonable to most of us today, we should keep in mind that these people were dealing with very limited or no knowledge of germ theory, and that it was commonplace in these rural villages to be completely mired in religion from the time they were born. They simply didn't know what they didn't know. And in these situations, it's also not uncommon for a sort of mob mentality to kick in. I'm not saying it's right, but it's still a phenomenon that's happening today, so it's important that we try to understand it. Also, people sometimes cling to superstition, like religion, because it's the only hope they have left in impossible situations, and it gives them a feeling of being able to control something. A lot of the time, it would be more beneficial to reach for greater education, instead of, or in tandem with, religion. Though today's scientists still struggle to explain the prevalence of the vampire panics that spread throughout New England, the common factor that unites them all is that they happened during devastating tuberculosis outbreaks. Once one or more family members died of TB, and then others in the household started falling ill, someone within the community would inevitably accuse one of the deceased of vampirism. This would lead to the body of the accused being exhumed. Then an examination would take place, looking for clues that the corpse was actually undead. The most common sign of vampirism was that the body still looked fresh and not as decomposed as would be expected. It would be even further proof if the heart still contained a lot of blood. The particulars of New England vampire exhumations seemingly varied state by state. In many cases, only family and neighbors participated. At other times, town leaders voted on the matter, or medical doctors or clergymen would be involved. In Maine and Plymouth, Massachusetts, the exhumed vampire's body was simply flipped face down in the grave and reburied. This was done to confuse the undead so they couldn't find their way out of the grave. But in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont, the accused vampire's heart and sometimes other internal organs would be removed and burned, with the afflicted sometimes inhaling the smoke or even ingesting the ashes as a potential cure. In Europe, where they had vampire panics of their own, exhumation practices also varied by region, with some suspected vampires' corpses being beheaded, or their feet bound with thorns. Most of these rituals were clandestine affairs, lit by lanterns under cover of darkness, but in some places, like Vermont in particular, they could be oddly festive. One accused vampire's heart was reportedly set ablaze on the Woodstock, Vermont town green in 1830. In 1793 in Manchester, Vermont, hundreds of people attended a heart-burning ceremony at a blacksmith's forge. One early town history reads, Timothy Meade officiated at the altar in the sacrifice to the demon vampire, who it was believed was still sucking the blood of the then living wife of Captain Burton. Then adds rather offhandedly, it was the month of February and good slaying. Sadly, the alleged vampire's accusers were more often than not their closest relatives, parents, spouses, or children. It does make you ponder, though, how superstitious and bizarre rituals like this seemingly spread like wildfire across oceans, regions, and cultures into every tiny backwoods crevice of this country. But useful scientific information, like how to wash your hands and cover your mouth to avoid a plague, took so long to reach more rural areas. I mean, granted, people brought old superstitions over from the old country, whichever country of origin that may have been for them, but it still feels a bit selective. But this view is also tainted by my personal observations in 2022 of people with the entire world of information at their fingertips with today's technology, who still choose to believe baseless, bizarre conspiracy theories, yet completely ignore or deny valid scientific information. I live in a small New England town. It often seems like not a whole lot has changed. It didn't help that newspapers of the time were also pretty much the same as today's, and picked up on New England vampire stories very quickly. It's believed their sensationalized coverage may have played a big role in the growing vampire panic. In September of 1884, the St. Charles Herald featured a front-page story on vampire attack reports, sharing details on the ritualistic methods being used in various parts of the world to stop them. While they didn't outright suggest the people of New England employ these techniques, many newspapers picked up the story, and it's thought that it's quite possible some of New England's vigilante vampire hunters got the idea directly from the news. There are actually many stories of New England vampires, all with their own unique details, and I'll probably explore more of them in future videos. But today, I'll tell you about the most famous and most well-documented of those stories, that of Mercy Brown. The tragic Brown family story took place in the small town of Exeter, Rhode Island, at the end of the 19th century. At that point in time, Exeter was far removed from its heyday. It was nicknamed Deserted Exeter, or simply known as one of the border towns. It was mostly a farming community, with very rocky, barely fertile soil. In most cases, families were barely harvesting enough to feed their own families. Farmers piled stones into walls around their fields, and corn had to be planted in wonky rows that swerved around the biggest boulders. Not exactly ideal farming conditions. In the late 1800s, Exeter's population was severely depleted. Civil War casualties had taken a toll on the community. New railroads and promises of richer land out west lured many of the remaining young men away. By 1892, the year of Mercy Brown's death, Exeter's population had dropped to just 961. That was a drastic drop from the high of more than 2,500 that had lived there in 1820. Many farms were abandoned and later seized and burned by the government. Some sections of Exeter looked like a ghost town, and the families that remained were being ravaged by tuberculosis. One of those families was that of George and Mary Eliza Brown. The Brown family lived on a modest homestead on the eastern edge of town. Some reports claim that the Browns had 7 children, others say 8. George Brown's Find a Grave page lists 5. Nearly all retellings of this story claim the only Brown children were the 3 who died that are mentioned in the story. Even the detailed information on genealogy sites confused the hell out of me, because they list different names for many of them. I doubted there were only the 3 children, though, because there are descendants of the family line still alive today, and they had to come from somewhere. I'll get into that a little more in a bit. I'll tell you the vampire part first. As far as local farming families of the time went, the Browns seemed to be pretty average and well-liked within their community. Sadly, the family's matriarch, Mary Eliza, contracted tuberculosis and died in December of 1882. Just over a year later, in 1884, the Browns' eldest daughter, Mary Olive, a 20-year-old dressmaker, died from TB as well. An obituary in a local newspaper says of Mary Olive's death, "The last few hours she lived was of great suffering, yet her faith was firm and she was ready for the change." The whole town turned out for her funeral and sang one sweetly solemn thought, a song Mary Olive herself had selected. This tells me the Browns were probably pretty well respected within the community, and that their community definitely didn't understand how tuberculosis was spread. About 5 or 6 years after the death of Mary Olive, the Browns' teenage son, Edwin, known to all as Eddie, began to feel unwell. As far as I can tell, Eddie was the Browns' only son. He worked as a store clerk at a general store called the Farmers Exchange and General Variety Store, just west of nearby Wickford Village. A local newspaper described him as a big, husky young man. By all accounts, he was pretty healthy and strong, until he suddenly wasn't. As Eddie's health deteriorated, he was diagnosed with consumption, the same dreaded disease that had killed his mother and older sister. Eddie was sent to Colorado Springs, Colorado in 1891. It was believed the dry climate, fresh mountain air, and mineral springs were therapeutic for people with breathing issues, particularly tuberculosis, aka consumption. In the absence of any legitimate treatment options, I suppose it was better than being covered in leeches. Yes, that was a thing. During the 18 months that Eddie was away in Colorado, his 19-year-old sister, Mercy Lena, who actually just went by the name Lena, suddenly became ill as well. Though she mostly went by her middle name and family nickname Lena, I'm going to use her first name Mercy for this video to minimize the confusion of using both of them. Mercy was most likely affected by tuberculosis long before she started showing symptoms, but remained asymptomatic until shortly before her death. She was a child at the time of her mother and sister's deaths, and it's unclear whether she or her brother Eddie contracted the disease from one of them or from someone else later. Oddly, the TB bacterium can stay in the body and take years to develop into the disease. For some infected people, it never develops into tuberculosis at all. Normally, the risk of disease lessens over time. After Mercy became ill, Eddie returned home from Colorado. His health had continued to decline there, and he was feeling homesick. He arrived home in much worse condition than when he'd left. There was a piece in the local paper that read, If the good wishes and prayers of his many friends could be realized, friend Eddie would speedily be restored to perfect health. The townspeople were very concerned for Edwin Brown's health, though I couldn't find anything written about the public's response to his sister Mercy's battle with the disease. It seems her health declined a lot more quickly than Eddie's, because on January 17, 1892, 19-year-old Mercy Brown was dead. Her obituary read, "Miss Lena Brown, who has been suffering from consumption, died Sunday morning." Eddie's health continued to decline drastically after Mercy's death. George Brown was devastated over the loss of his wife and now 2 of his daughters, and couldn't bear the thought of losing his son next. Eddie was wasting away before George's and the community of Exeter's eyes. Over the 2 years he'd been sick, he grew increasingly thinner and sicker. Tuberculosis had completely ravaged his body, and he struggled to breathe as he continually coughed up blood. George grew increasingly more desperate to save his son, but he felt completely helpless against the disease that had devastated his family time and again. And that's why when several concerned Exeter citizens approached George with an outlandish proposition based on an old folk tale, he wasn't as quick to tell them to buzz off as he probably normally would have been. The group told George that the only way to possibly save his son would be to exhume the bodies of his wife and daughters to examine them for vampirism. Believing that one of them must be trapped between heaven and hell, sucking the life out of young Eddie from beyond the grave. George was very reluctant to disturb his loved one's eternal slumber, but he eventually granted permission for the exhumations. There are other stories in circulation about Exeter townsfolk reportedly seeing Mercy walking around the cemetery and through fields after her death, and of her brother Eddie claiming that Mercy was sitting on his chest, suffocating him. This seems highly unlikely. If everyone was convinced Mercy was a vampire before the exhumation, why would they have exhumed all 3 of the bodies? I'm pretty sure this is all just part of the lore that's continually grown over time. Though it is reported that Edwin's TB symptoms included terrible dreams of suffocation and drowning, and that in the mornings he felt as if the blood had been drained from his body. That wouldn't be unusual with tuberculosis. On March 17, 1892, several unnamed shovel-wielding villagers, along with a newspaper reporter and a very reluctant local doctor named Dr. Harold Metcalf, known as Doc, attended the exhumation of the 3 Brown women at Exeter's Chestnut Hill Cemetery. George couldn't bear to see his family members in a state of decomposition, and Eddie was far too sick to attend. The family's undertaker, George T. Cranston, also refused to attend because it was just ridiculous to him. He'd prepared all 3 of the Brown women's corpses and was certain they were thoroughly dead. The bodies of both Mary Eliza and Mary Olive showed the expected levels of decomposition. They were mostly skeletal after being in the ground for a decade, so they were ruled out as suspects. The body of young Mercy Brown was another story entirely. Now, Mercy had only been dead for about 2 months, during a Rhode Island winter where average temperatures hover around freezing today. In the 1890s, winters were usually much harsher. To the best of anyone's knowledge, she'd been stored in an above-ground crypt during that time, which would have effectively served as a freezer. Mercy's body showed almost no decomposition, and when they prodded her corpse with a shovel, they found that her heart was still full of blood. So full that it seemed ready to start beating again. That would have to be a bit more than a prodding to come to that realization, wouldn't it? Other accounts claim this was discovered after the doctor cut her heart out. To the townspeople, this was absolute proof that Mercy was a vampire, no matter how insistently Dr. Metcalf objected and tried to explain basic science and common sense. They also claimed her hair and fingernails had grown. Hair and nails actually may appear longer after death, but this is because the skin around them retracts due to dehydration, causing soft tissue to shrink. Another claim that I've seen mentioned sporadically is that Lucy was positioned on her side in the coffin when they opened it up. I have no idea if this detail is original to the story or was added over time. As superstition prevailed, Mercy's heart and liver was set aflame and reduced to ashes on a nearby bedrock outcrop. Those ashes were mixed with water to form a tonic, which George hesitantly fed to Eddie in a last-ditch effort to cure his illness and stop the shenanigans of the undead. Regardless, Eddie died 2 months later. Because the illness died with him, and no other family members or close neighbors contracted the consumption, the locals considered the treatment a success. At least, that's what most of today's retellings of this story lead us to believe. But there are actually death records that appear to be clear evidence that George Brown went on to lose 3 more daughters to tuberculosis. A daughter named Annie Laura, then 25 years old and married to a man named Charles Edward Taylor, died on August 9, 1895. That same year, 3 years after Edwin's death, another daughter named Jenny Adeline, who was 18 and married to a man named William Henry Edwards, died on October 2, 1895. That means George lost 2 more daughters just 2 months apart. And then, on June 25, 1899, just 4 years later, he lost another daughter named Myra Frances. Myra was 18 years old and married to a man named Arthur Caswell. This left only George and Mary Brown's 5th-born child, Hattie Mae, who survived to get married twice and give birth to 5 children, 3 of which died in infancy between 1893 and 1899. Hattie lived until 1954 and died at age 79. That would bring the total number of the Browns' children up to 7, and shows that the tragic story of the Brown family definitely didn't end with Edwin's death. While the story usually tells us George Brown was especially devastated over the thought of losing his son, to the point of turning to vampire superstition, because that was the last child he had left, I guess it also makes sense that an 1800s farmer would probably still feel pretty desperate about losing his one son when all of his other kids were girls, because the girls would have been expected to get married and leave, which those who survived long enough apparently did. A son may have been more inclined to keep helping him with the family farm, or he also could have just been George's favorite. Mercy's body, or what was left of it, was finally interred in the Brown family plot of the Chester Hill Cemetery. In this case, I feel like it may not have been just ghoulish curiosity or a rabid superstitious mob mentality that compelled the Exeter townsfolk to investigate one of their own as a vampire, but more of a desperate attempt to help their beloved neighbors, George and Edwin, in a dire situation. At least that's what I want to believe, though the desecration of a young woman's remains and the accusation of sucking the life out of her brother, followed by the immolation and cannibalism of her vital organs, is decidedly very rude and disrespectful at best. Grief, fear, and desperation make people do crazy things. George Brown never did contract tuberculosis and died of unknown causes in Exeter, Rhode Island at the age of 80 in 1922. Mercy Brown's exhumation and desecration came at the end of the New England vampire panic. Many historians actually say hers was the last case of this particular brand of early American hysteria, giving her the titles of the last New England vampire and the quintessential American vampire story. The discovery of the cause of tuberculosis and simple methods of preventing it seemed to put an end to the vampire hunting era. Still, it didn't stop Rhode Island from becoming known as the vampire capital of America and the Transylvania of North America. And while Mercy Lena Brown lived a very short life, she left behind a legacy that'll survive long after you and I are gone. Her surviving relatives saved local newspaper clippings and family scrapbooks and have told the Brown family story at Exeter's Decoration Day, which is when the town's residents decorate local cemeteries in honor of their dead. They also managed to preserve a real treasure, a quilt Mercy made as a young girl. The quilt is described as blue, pink, and cream-colored, with large brown patches that, if you look closely, actually show fields of daisies. Textile scholars at the University of Rhode Island managed to date the scraps of florals, plaid, and paisleys to the 1870s and 1880s, during Mercy's childhood. They think Mercy may have used fabric from her sister and mother's old dresses. A Brown family descendant named Dorothy O'Neill is quoted as saying, "I think the quilt is quite exquisite, especially in light of what she went through in her life. She ended up leaving behind something beautiful. She didn't know she'd have to leave it, but she did." The quilt's pattern is called the Wandering Foot. Oddly, there's even a pretty apropos superstition attached to that pattern, claiming anybody who slept under it would be lost to their family, doomed to wander. And that's not the only legacy Mercy Brown left behind. It's reported that when Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, died in 1897. Newspaper accounts of Mercy Brown's story were found in his files. It's widely believed that Mercy inspired the novel's character Lucy Westenra. Lucy is one of Dracula's most fascinating characters, a 19-year-old girl, the same age as Mercy Brown at her death, who's Count Dracula's first English victim. In the book, Lucy suffers from worsening sleepwalking and dementia, as Dracula continually feeds on her and gradually drains her of her blood. This could be compared to the long, drawn-out death that comes with a tuberculosis infection. After her death, Lucy rises from her grave as a vampire, feeding on local children. She's eventually exhumed from her crypt and killed as a vampire with a stake through her heart. The Brown family story is also referred to in Rhode Island native H.P. Lovecraft's novelette, The Shunned House, with the line, "Don't hire anyone from the Nooseneck Hill country, the seat of uncomfortable superstitions." As late as 1892, an Exeter community exhumed a dead body and ceremoniously burnt its heart in order to prevent certain alleged visitations. He also named one of the book's characters Mercy Dexter, another potential nod to Mercy Brown. Local legend also swears that Mercy Brown's ghost still haunts Exeter. Her spirit is said to visit those who are terminally ill, to assure them that death isn't anything to fear. She's also seen on a particular bridge, and her spirit's accompanied by the smell of roses. Some visitors to the cemetery where she's buried even claim to have recordings of her voice. Mercy Brown's gravesite is also visible through an opening in a nearby tombstone. Local lore tells us that if you look through that opening at Mercy Brown's grave and say 3 times, "Mercy Brown, are you a vampire?" you can conjure her ghost. Mercy's story has also been featured in various documentaries, young adult novels, nonfiction books, movies, and songs. Today, Mercy Brown's grave is a very popular tourist destination. Visitors leave little gifts for her like jewelry, notes, black plastic roses, and plastic vampire fangs. Mercy's grave is situated in the Brown family plot in Exeter's Chestnut Hill Cemetery, a small graveyard behind a tiny white Baptist church beneath an evergreen tree. Most of the Brown family is there in Chestnut Hill, along with their locally famous revival-style preacher Edwin Wood, who would have comforted George Brown through all of his unfathomable losses. Perhaps Edwin Brown was even named after him. Mercy's gravestone is reinforced with a metal band connected to a post embedded in the ground. This isn't to keep her from rising from the dead, it's to keep the gravestone from being stolen. In fact, over the years it's been broken, stolen twice, and the epitaph has been rubbed off. Directly across the cemetery from the family plot is a small triangular stone building, which is believed to be the crypt Mercy's body was originally stored in. Exeter historian Sheila Reynolds Boothroyd is quoted as saying, "All we want here in Exeter is for Lena to be treated with the respect she deserves. She was not a vampire, but a young girl, who died a very unfortunate and untimely death." Today, Exeter has a reputation for being one of the most haunted towns in Rhode Island. It has a population of 6,711, so it's grown considerably since the time of the vampire panic. It's described as offering residents a suburban rural mix feel, where many young professionals live, with highly rated public schools. That sounds like a far cry from its subsistence farming days, but still small enough to know your neighbors. Let's hope they don't get quite as involved in each other's business as they did in 1892. Every Halloween, Mercy or Lena Brown's story is told again in the press and here on YouTube, drawing new attention and new visitors to Exeter, though with each retelling it seems to lose a little bit of the original detail. I did my best to preserve it here. There are always things to learn from these stories of the past. In this one, I guess it would be to value science over superstition, because we're so fortunate to have the medical advancements today that so many didn't have before us. And digging up bodies, incinerating parts of them, and ingesting them is just a terribly unnecessary waste of time and energy. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this story and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if your town has any interesting lore, I'd love to hear all about it in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.